Congratulations to all of our graduates. You're beginning an exciting phase of life. It will be a big time of transformation, undoubtedly, in your life, and I pray that God is with you every step of the way. If you were visiting with us this morning, I'm so glad that you are here. Catch me outside in the hall. I'd love to shake your hand and get to know your name. Also, this afternoon, we have a chili cook-off that we're calling the Chili Wing Ding, and so that's starting at 4. I hope that you will come and enjoy some chili with us, and if not the chili, just come and enjoy a good time together. And so we hope to see you there. As many of you know, I was homeschooled, and one thing that homeschoolers were known for was a reverential respect for our founding fathers. We treated them almost as patriarchs of the faith, if you will. And it wasn't really until my adult life that I learned that they were actually just, human people with human challenges, and they also were sinners just like you and I. And I remember reading a couple years back, David McCullough had that really great book, 1776, talking about the life of George Washington. And I was reading this book, having returned from the mission field and kind of a difficult period in life and transition. And he was talking about this time in George Washington's life where this was the winter of Valley Forge. So the British had holed up in Boston. They had the city, the comfortable life, and all of his men are basically camping in the woods in the winter in Virginia with little to eat, outmanned, outgunned, demoralized. And he writes this in a letter. He says, "I've often thought of how much happier I should have been if instead of accepting a command under such circumstances, I had taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the ranks, or if I could have justified the measure of posterity and my own conscience, had retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam. If I shall be able to rise superior to these and many other difficulties which I might enumerate, I shall most religiously believe that the finger of providence is in it, to blind the eyes of our enemies for sure." He's writing basically, look, if I had known how bad it would have been, wouldn't it have been better just to have kind of gone to the back country and camped this one out? I could sit in my wigwam, throw a line out in the water, shoot some animals, just kind of, enjoy life a little bit. And I think he's expressing something that many people feel in life, which is, if I knew then what I knew now, I would have done things differently. I would have picked plan A instead of plan B. I would have taken job C instead of job D, moved to city E instead of city F. This happens to everyone. I think it gets particularly complicated for those of us when we are following God, when God is giving you a passion, when he's giving you a direction in your life, when he's saying, come follow me in this regard, come obey me, come try that project, talk to your neighbor, join this ministry. And then it doesn't happen according to plan. The road gets hard, it gets rocky, there's challenges, because it not only is frustrating just at a human level, it calls our faith into question. Is God good? Did he really send me on this? Why would he send me on this to let me fail? Can I really understand his will? Can I discern his voice and his leading in my life? Am I just wrong? What do I make of all of this? This idea of turning back or wishing we had never started to begin with is a pretty common feeling. Even in the Bible, we have characters like Elijah, Jeremiah, and Jonah. Big names. All of them wished that they had never been born, and some of them asked God to kill him. It's a common feeling. The children of Israel, they had been brought out of slavery, and in the middle of the desert, while they're between slavery and the promised land, they have this conversation of, don't you remember how good our life was back in slavery? Why don't we just return to Egypt? Even in the New Testament, the audience of the book of Hebrews and also 1 John are directed at groups that are thinking of, they've come into Christianity and life has changed for them, and now they're thinking of returning and going back to Judaism. Why is it that God sends us on a plan and then gives us speed bumps? Isn't he supposed to be efficient? Right? Isn't he about getting the job done? He gives us the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And then it seems like through political turmoil and warlords and famines and natural disasters and economic downturns that it's one of the hardest things for missionaries to go and to be effective. Isn't God supposed to be efficient? You see, efficiency is part of our cultural narrative as Americans. We came across the ocean on boats, carved a living out of the wilderness. We have this can-do attitude that's not present in many other countries in the world. Many other countries are used to living with lack of resources, lack of leadership. Christians in other countries are used to knowing that they might have to pray for a generation to wait for God to bring the resources that they need to get the job done. Again, if we look at Bible characters, Daniel was turned over to the lions. He was also thrown in the fire. Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren for 89 years. Joseph was a slave for 13 years. He was a slave for 13 years before God elevated him to number 2 in Egypt. So it seems like when God calls us, he calls us to go through challenges. Challenges are part of the journey. This series, we're talking about following God in impossible times. This is the journey that Israel went through when they came out of exile in Babylon and into the land, and what would happen there. As we've been talking the last couple of weeks, they've set up the altar, and they're now worshiping God in Jerusalem again, but there's no temple, there's no walls, and this is the chapter where there's a shift. It's like a movie where everything's going fine, then all of a sudden the new character comes into the situation, and that's about to change everything. Following God in impossible times means overcoming the challenge of deceptive unity. Let's look at Ezra chapter 4. I'll read verses 1 through 4. It says, "When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said, 'Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God, and we've been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here.' But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the heads of the families of Israel answered, 'You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us.' Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building." In this story, the Jews are actually exhibiting something we don't often see. They're exhibiting discernment. This is not a trait that they're known for historically. If you think back to the book of Joshua, the people are going into the land the first time, and God has said, don't make a treaty with anybody. Don't make any treaties. And what do? There's this little group called the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites, they hear about this Israeli army and this God named Yahweh who's fighting their battles. They've heard about Jericho and the walls falling down, a great city being taken. And so they say, you know what? Let's pretend like we're from a far country. Let's put on some old clothes. Let's get some moldy, crusty bread. Let's get some old wine bags. And let's go in and convince them to make a treaty with us. And so the Jews, in that passage, it says they did not consult the Lord. They made a treaty with them. They used their eyes, their physical eyes, to go, okay, look at the situation. They're from such a far country. This doesn't violate God's word. We need ask no more questions, not even of God. They made a treaty. Turns out they're their neighbors. But here we see Israel is seeing through the trick. The trick is, we want to worship your God with you. And the reality was they didn't. This passage opens with the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. Right? These are the people trying to stop the work. They are dismayed that the temple is being rebuilt. And they actually have a very clear vision of what is the future with a temple, an Israeli temple right there, going to mean for them. I think they had a clearer vision than some of the Jews had at the time. They're not the only people to go through this. In Matthew chapter 2, this is the birth narrative of Jesus, where Jesus is born. And King Herod welcomes in the wise men who say, hey, we're from the east. We're here to worship the new king. And basically, he commissions them to go. Verse 8 of Matthew 2, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go worship him. Another time, this is a trick. It's a trap. Not everyone who says that they are following God is following God. Someone sent me a picture of a python and a goat, and the goat is in the python's death grip, where you see them wrap around it. It was a sizable python. And the title said, "Caution, not everyone who hugs you is your friend." It's good advice, especially if the one hugging you is a python. Not everyone that hugs you is your friend. Jesus says in Matthew 10:16, he says, "I'm sending you out like sheep amongst wolves, therefore be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves." We're to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. He's not sending us out as fighters, as brawlers, but he is sending us out with wisdom and discernment to know how should we act, how should we talk. We have to have that wisdom, at the same time have the harmlessness and the peacefulness of a dove. We need to be careful not to separate ourselves from common human causes, shared human causes. At the same time, we have to be discerning that we don't sacrifice our biblical principles. We have to be careful that we're not unaware of someone's ulterior motive or hidden agenda. Our culture right now is telling Christians, you guys are all bad. You've done a lot of bad things, and we're going to take it from here. I preached a sermon a few weeks ago about what does the Bible say about ethnic diversity and unity, and what does God have to say with that? Right? It's right there in the scriptures. When God made Abraham a blessing to all peoples, it talks about all the peoples he was surrounded with. Right? This is not a hidden part of the Bible that we have to be embarrassed about. This is something we can celebrate and be proud of. Christians throughout history, in spite of what culture is telling us right now, have worked hard to do things like end slavery. They helped establish freedom of religion in the United States. The initial 13 colonies did not have freedom of religion. That came later. They've set up hospitals, orphanages, and schools all around the world, most of which are still operational today, in places that are places where no one else wants to go. They protested and transformed the industrial era and how people were treated in urban centers. You had children working in factories using dangerous machinery. At this time in cities like Chicago and New York, opiates and heroin and that kind of stuff was available over the counter, and children were using this. Christians were part of the movement against that. They achieved prison reform in the UK and the United States. Christians saw how bad the prisons were. Prior to this time, they were essentially kind of a poorhouse where if you were thrown into prison, it was expected of your family to take care of you. Well, in the days of farming and no limited travel, how do you take care of a loved one that's in the city when you live miles and miles away on the farm? The answer is you don't. They starve to death. They exposed global issues. They helped end foot binding of young Chinese girls in China. They helped shine a light on the caste system and sati, which is the self-cremation in India that women would do to help their husbands gain a higher reincarnation. They've shined a light on female genital mutilation in sub-Saharan Africa. They fought against human trafficking all over the world. These are things that Christians have been a part of that our culture is telling us you've done nothing on. Now, part of this is we need to get in touch with our own story in our own history. Now, I'm not trying to say that we are perfect on all of these issues, that we've always had a perfect record, that we have no blind spots in our past. We absolutely do, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute because those are in the text for them as well. We have lots of blind spots. But we also have many things that the Bible teaches us that we ought to be about because this is what God is about. God is about binding up the brokenhearted and opening the prisons and releasing those who are bound. This is part of the messianic ministry. We shouldn't be embarrassed by this. We should be aware of what Christians have done in the past. But all of this that's happening right here in the text had a certain effect. In verse 4, the effect is it made them afraid of building. It says the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. In the previous chapter, 3 verse 3, it says, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundations and sacrificed burnt offerings to the Lord, both morning and evening. So the fear is present in both chapters, but we're going to see in this chapter, the fear takes a turn. The fear takes over. It takes hold. Following God in impossible times means overcoming the challenge of organized criticism. Let's read on in verses 5 through 7. It says, they bribed the officials, this is the enemies of Judah, they bribed the officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his advocates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script and in Aramaic language. Skipping down to verse 11, it says, this is the copy of the letter they sent to them. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who come up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that this city is being built and its walls are restored. No more taxes or tribute or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city, a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition, this is why the city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. That's some serious organized criticism. I'll remind you from the intro of this series that Persia was one of the first world empires at this time, that they joined the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And to help cope with managing such a wide kingdom, they established one of the first postal systems. And we're seeing some of their letters. We're going to see a few more throughout Ezra and Nehemiah as they continue this letter-writing campaign back and forth. Verse 6, he's opening up, and they're writing a letter to King Xerxes. Xerxes is the king that appears in Esther by a different name, King Ahasuerus. This is why in the reading guide, if you haven't picked one up, we still have more out there. But in the reading guide, there's several different books that are all in this time period that you can read along side by side. So here's the question. Are they wrong in their assertion? The assertion is the building is happening, and if the building happens, it's going to end their tribute to you. By the way, this is a historic problem for these people. They're rebellious, they're cantankerous, they're going to do it. They've done it to your predecessors, they will do it again. It's not a false accusation. It's largely factual. Go read the closing of Kings, go read the closing of Chronicles. It details how did they make alliances with Babylon and then break them off, and how were they conquered. They were correct. The Jews were rebellious. All around us today, we hear voices of criticism and antagonism. Worldviews, religions, and ways of life that are contrary to the Bible are being paraded through the street, just like modern-day Babylon. They're being held up and said, this is right, this is true, and speak against this, shame on you. What do we do? They're at a pivotal point where the letter's been sent, shots have been fired. Are they going to bow down before this? Are they going to yield? Are they going to submit? But the question is very similar for us. We know what God says. It's not a problem of a lack of knowledge. We have the Bible. What will we do? At this point, they were still working in spite of the fear. They were afraid, but they were worshiping. They were afraid, but they're still building. They're still working towards the goal. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to not know the outcome of something. It's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to try this. I might lose my job. I'm going to try this. For us as missionaries, we might get kicked out of the country. We might lose our home. I'm going to try this. I might lose that relationship. But I'm going to try it. I don't know the outcome, but I know what God calls us to do. Jesus says it this way in John 9:4. He says, as long as it's day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no man can work. Jesus is aware that there's a time for the church, for his followers to be active, to be working, because night is coming. We can see this has happened already throughout our lifetimes on a global scale. When I was a kid, we prayed for Russia. Anybody else pray for Russia when you're younger? Right? We prayed for the church in Russia, for Christians in Russia, for missionaries to be able to get into Russia. We prayed for Christians in China. In my college years, we prayed for the Muslim world, for the Christians in the Muslim world, for the church in the Muslim world. It's very aware that we're not alone in a struggle against criticism, but we have to work before the night comes. Ephesians 5:16 says, "Make the best use of time because the days are evil." Or other translations say, "Redeem the time because the days are evil." God hasn't called us to comfort. He hasn't called us to isolation, to our own little world and our own little kingdom, even if that kingdom is Mountain View or the Christian Missionary Alliance or just North American Christians. We're not called to this bubble. We need to be active working because the days are evil and night is coming. It gets harder and harder and harder as time goes. Following God means we have to overcome the challenge of organized criticism. This is not easy, but it is necessary. Following God in impossible times means overcoming the challenge of a bad reputation. They certainly had a bad reputation. Now, letter number 1 to King Artaxerxes, this is just their side of the story. He says, go look in the records and see what the records show. So he says, okay. Verse 17, he goes on. This is from King Artaxerxes. It says, the king sent this reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been the place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order for these men to stop work so that the city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let the threat grow to the detriment of royal interests? Here's the outcome. The king says, look, I looked into the matter. I went to the library, had a study day, and here's what I figured out. You're right. The criticisms are true. Tell them to stop working until you hear from me. I mentioned before that there were many things throughout Christian history that we should be proud of, that we should learn about and celebrate and talk about, that I don't think the secular world knows. I don't think the media knows that Christians have been involved in these things. This next list is going to sting a little bit because these are the things they do know about. I don't want to paint a false picture about Christianity or its involvement in social issues. And so there's a light and a dark side to our involvement in the world. So we ended many things, but we also were part of the wrong side of many things. Christians in China, foreign Christians in China, were part of the Opium Wars and the opium trade in China. This led to the Boxer Rebellion and many missionaries getting killed and or kicked out of the country. Christians have been involved in the slave trade, crusades. In modern times, we're known for being hateful towards groups that don't agree with Christianity. You might think of Texas as a really conservative, God and country kind of place, but the reality is sinners are sinners and sinners are everywhere. Houston's actually fairly liberal as a city where I'm from. We were the first city of our size to have a lesbian mayor. We beat out, I think, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, LA, all the other big metropolitan centers. It's kind of surprising, judging by the looks on your faces. Pastors in Houston squared off with the mayor for a while, and to be fair, she fed right into their plan. Also, you could just look up her name, Anise Parker, fights with pastors. If you Google that, a bunch of articles will come up. And kind of in the heat of it, pastors are mailing boxes of Bibles to her office to make some kind of statement. Where's the witness in that? See, we fight down in the dirt, and then we wonder why we're muddy. We're called to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. Sometimes we get that mixed up, right? We're as dangerous as serpents and as dumb as doves. We've got to get the order back. We play into the cultural narrative that we're this hateful, vengeful group when we do things like that. People think of us as hypocritical. In staff meeting this week, we talked about the number of churches, the number of pastors, and the number of Christian institutions that are just in the throes of turmoil, in the throes of scandal. We have some right here in the Seattle area that this has been true for. We can't be unaware that as Christians, we have a bad reputation to overcome. We can't look into the history and look into the past and go, well, let's paint with rose colors and just write it all really nice. We have to be aware of we have our own reputation to overcome. How are we going to do it? Option A, we join the ranks of those who say that Christianity is fake because of our reputation. I can't tell you the number of people that come into my office or young people on college campuses that I've talked with that say Christians are fake. I grew up in the church and I saw how fake they were, and so I don't believe any of it anymore. Jesus can't be true. The Bible's not true because Christians are fake. That's true. A lot of fake Christians, a lot of hypocrites. Jesus came for people who were sinful and broken. It shouldn't surprise us that the Bible tells us he's a friend of sinners, and then you look around in his friend group and we're a bunch of sinners. Where's the shock? There should be no shock in this. Why is there shock? We should expect to find people that are broken in church, people who are struggling with anger in church, people who are hypocrites. It should be an expectation because this is what the Bible tells us. Just think for a moment, you go to the hospital, are we turned off by finding sick people there? No. Where do sick people go? You go to the hospital, get some help. Are we shocked to see criminals in a police station? Broken cars in an auto shop? No, these are the places that we go when we need these things. We could play this the other way and say, are we shocked when we find people cheating on their diet in the candy store? No, we're not shocked. It's human nature, right? Go to the candy store. You see a lot of fit people there. Cheat day. A lot of cheat days. The answer, so option A is we just get in line with this and we say, you know what? You're right. There's a bunch of hypocrites. The Bible just must be false. Well, the Bible is based on historic reality. Jesus either is a real person or he's not. If he's not, throw it away because it really is worthless. If he is, forget his followers because the Bible tells us his followers are a bunch of sinful people. So option A is to get in line and just let them tell us what to think of, okay, you're right. I'm going to go off to college, and I'm just going to forget this whole Christian thing because they're all hypocrites. Guess what? Every sector of society, every religious group, every non-religious group has hypocrites. Option B is the one I like. We live as being transformed into the image of Christ. Are there hypocrites out there? Yeah. That doesn't give me an excuse to live like that. Are there people who lie about their faith? Yes. Are there people here for wrong motives? Absolutely. That does not give me any excuse. I've been crucified with Christ. I've been raised with Christ. I'm a new creation with Christ. I better start living like it, regardless of what anyone does. We have to live a transformed life. The answer is not less Christianity. It's less superficial Christianity. See, people go, oh, well, back when I was a Christian, I did X, Y, and Z. Maybe you weren't really a Christian. I mean, I know a lot of people who hang out at the mechanic shops that are not mechanics. See a lot of people on the trails that are not hikers. We don't need less Christianity. We need less superficial Christianity. We need to think of it this way. We need to think of Christendom as being this big cultural Christian bubble. Okay? We need less Christendom and we need more Christ in our lives. It's less about what's the Christian label on my shirt, what's the bumper sticker on my bumper, and are these something pithy and Christian? It has to do more with, am I exhibiting love to my enemies, to my neighbors, to my family? This is challenging. It's challenging in our day. It's challenging for the next generation of Christians, our children, that we've handed our own very mixed bag of good things that we've been a part of and some things where we've come down on the wrong side. Instead of defending, we just need to be willing to say, you know what? That was sinful. God has called a bunch of sinful people to work for him. We're not sure why this is his plan, but it's his glory to do this, and here we are. Following God in impossible times means overcoming the challenge of fearful submission. I mentioned that as we go through this series, we're being given a narrative for what does it look like to stand up to the powers that be that are against God. There's a story for biblical resistance. But in this exact chapter, that's not what we're going to see. We're going to see them succumb to the challenge of fearful submission. Verses 23 to 24 says, as soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Verse 24, thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. Chapter 4 stands as opposite to chapter 3. Chapter 3, they are there. The worship is beginning again. The altar is being rebuilt. Everything is headed in the right direction. Chapter 4, everything comes to a standstill. It's an ominous note. It's a sad note. It's a dark note of the work stopped. We often think the goal of persecution is to kill people or to torture people. The goal of persecution is not to kill and to torture. The goal of persecution is to silence. What do we do when the cultural forces come in around us? What do we do when laws are established that seem to be against the faith? What do we do in the workplace when there's policies put in place that violate our faith? We're not the first Christians to have to struggle through this. During our time in the Middle East, our team went from being about 100 units, which was their warm, fuzzy way of talking about families. So our family represented one unit, even though we were 5 people, and a single person represents one unit in their measurement. We went from being 100 units down to 7 during our short time there. The government got good at spotting Southerners and kicking them out. They weren't hard to find, to be fair. Every time I can remember, we would hear, teammate so-and-so in such and such city got kicked out. Fear would come across the team. There's nothing wrong with the fear. That's human. But what do we do with the fear? There are many people on the team who would be so afraid that they would sit inside their house for the next 3 weeks and talk to no one and do nothing. Now, don't judge them until you've been there, okay? But the idea that ultimately all of these cultural forces, all of these laws, and in the case over there, people being kicked out, had less to do with the physical world. We're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities. The idea that Satan wins by our silence seemed unthinkable to me. And almost in an obnoxious way, I said, you know what? I'm going to fight every human instinct I have. My human instinct is I'm going to stay inside. Thus, I will not stay inside. I would go sit at a coffee shop. Those were my most effective weeks of I'm just going to sit there and talk to people until they stop talking to me. I am not going to let the fear silence me, because if the fear silences me, persecution wins. If we wring our hands and say, the government passed this, the school district passed that, the workplace passed that, and we close our mouths, we are allowing them to win. Now, the alternate solution is not, let's all go fight, let's all go picket, okay? We have to find that wise as serpents, harmless as doves, standing with truth and love together. How do we live in that space? Because we've seen Christians on both sides. We've seen some that just allow it to silence them, and we've seen some that say, you know what, this is a hill on which to die. And the answer is we have to follow Christ. It's very rarely do we see the example of Christians speaking truth in love with that kind of wise balance, but we need to be more like this, of knowing how to stand up for our faith, but in a way that doesn't just come off as angry. This is a sad moment in the story. The work came to a stop. It came to a stop for 16 years. Think about this, kids. You move to another state, Palestine, to work on the temple, and your mom and dad are part of this project, and you're in elementary school, and because of some social backlash, the work stops, and you're still living in this place with no wall and no temple, and everybody's kind of against you. For a full, almost generation, the work stops. Like, you come back, graduate with college, maybe working on your master's degree before they pick up the project again. It's a long time. It's a long time to have moved to another place to not accomplish the goals that you thought you were going to accomplish. We want to look at the Bible characters as heroes, and we want to be disappointed with them when they fail and have human tendencies. But the reality is, none of this book right here is written to make us look good. It's written to make God look good. God isn't writing a story where Moses and Noah and Abraham are the heroes, where Paul and Silas and Peter are the heroes. None of them are the heroes. Modern church history should not be written around the pastors and the theologians and the great thinkers of our age being the heroes. We're all sinners. God gives us impossible tasks, I believe, to crush that spirit, that vibe, that we should be the heroes of our stories. We're not. See, they're sent into the land, given a project, and almost immediately it both starts and stops within a chapter for 16 years. Ezra's not the hero of this story. Neither is Nehemiah. Neither are any of these people. God wants to be the hero of the story. God gives us impossible tasks to bring us to the end of our rope, so that at the end of our rope we realize, God, unless you break through and act, nothing will happen. Amen. That's what he wanted all along. The whole Bible's impossible. We know this about our salvation. This is where the gospel comes in, right? We can't save ourselves. We have already blown it. That ship has already sailed. There's no going back and living a perfect life now. But now we can't clean ourselves up because we're covered in our evil deeds. It's like when you get oil on your hands and then you can't wipe it on your shirt. Now your shirt's dirty. You can't wipe it on your other hand. Now you have two dirty hands. What do you do? You need something outside of you to clean you up. This is where the gospel comes in. Jesus died for our sins so that our sin is covered by his robe of righteousness, by his robe of his blood. It washes and covers us. We can't do it on our own. Now, we know that about salvation. But we have to think in terms of everything. Every story in the Bible, it seems like God brings them to a breaking point before they realize we could never do this in our own strength to start with. God has to fight our battles, and you see them call out to him. The work came to a standstill. It leaves us with a lot of questions. Would they continue worshiping? See, they didn't have to have the temple to worship. They were already worshiping in the last chapter. They're still worshiping in this chapter before the temple is done. They started worshiping correctly, but now there's all of this backlash. Would they keep on worshiping? The text doesn't answer this question. We don't know. They didn't have to have the temple. They only had to have the means to have a right relationship with God to continue worshiping. Would they go back to their old ways? Would they follow other gods? Would they decide, you know what? The God that brought us out of captivity is not as strong as the gods of Babylon. Would they come back to this problem in their mind? This is the problem they walked into Babylon with, which is, well, it seems like Yahweh is not strong enough to protect his people. He is. But now they're back at this moment where they're asking this question: is God stronger than Marduk? Is Yahweh better than Marduk? Shouldn't we just go back to Babylon and be good Babylonian citizens, be good Persian citizens? What will we do when the voice of criticism grows stronger? See, right now, it's easy for Christians in America to have a persecution complex of everything's against us, they're dragging us into the streets, but it's simply not true. What we're facing is criticism. But what about should it turn to persecution, what will happen? There's one Christian scholar that's done study on persecuted Christians around the world, and he compares two cases, the case of the Russian church and the Chinese church, and what happened when persecution came. Chinese church went underground and came out from persecution stronger. They had multiplied exponentially during the time of persecution. The Russian church was almost completely wiped out. What will we do as criticism grows? Will we say, you know what? I'm going to go find somewhere better to live. It's more friendly. I have a news flash for you. There are sinners everywhere. There are people who are against the faith everywhere. There's no escaping this. We've done this in cities for a long time where people lived in one neighborhood. The phenomenon is called white flight, where people establish a neighborhood, and then people who are not like them move into the neighborhood, and they say, you know what, we're going to move out. But there's a phenomena happening now in every single city across the country, which is different migrant groups and people of other ethnicities are also moving out, looking for better places to live. So at first, the urban centers were predominantly white, and then they moved out to suburbia and established suburbia, which was predominantly white. But now they're recognizing that suburban areas are becoming very multi-ethnic, very diverse. And from a Christian standpoint, I just ask churches and go, you know what? How far does God have to send these people till we just share the gospel with them like we're supposed to? Because I guarantee you, if you just keep moving further and further out, God's going to keep sending everybody further and further away. God has a mission that he is going to accomplish with or without us. What will we do when the voices of criticism grow stronger? I just want to leave you with that question. And we're going to leave it. I want to continue on and talk about them restarting the work and finishing the work, but I think we need to pause this week and just reflect on the work came to a stop for 16 years. What will we do when things get hard? Let me close this in a word of prayer. God, we know that you are the hero of our story. We recognize you are the hero of our lives. We want to worship you and praise you as such and always revere and respect you in this regard. God, as hard as troubling times are, as hard as challenges are in our life, we thank you that these are the things you use to show us who you are. We thank you that these are the times where you show your strength and your power. Help us to see these and to anticipate them with excitement in advance. God, I pray for us today. I pray for the church in America today. That as the conversation is turning and turning against us, that you would give us hearts of perseverance, that you would give us hearts of courage. Not that we're not afraid, not that we're not concerned, but that we know who you are, and we know that you have a mission that you are going to accomplish. Give us hearts of perseverance. Help us to rely on you, not just for our salvation, but for every day. We need you every hour. I ask this in your name.